This is going to be a solo podcast from the Patriotarchy. I'm, of course, JP, and this is going to be more so on humanism. And this is going to delineate into a couple different topics, but more so individuality and humanism has really come up as a very prominent value in the West, more so than it is in the East, because there's less collectivization with that. But as far as humanism goes, we're really focused on the self, the I, the center, and you could go into the classic Freudian parts with this, the classic id, I, ego, things of that nature, and how they have or are at the behest of the individual. The old classic line, me, myself, and I, is a straight derivative from a Freudian. Well, I wouldn't call it, a presupposition. I wouldn't even call it a supposition. I would more so lean into the fact that it is just a straight-on imposition. Because if we're literally going to impose our will as human beings, we're going to find a way to have a very strong connection to both ourselves and one another. And why would we not have a strong connection to one another if we don't have a strong connection to ourselves? Now, obviously, I'm speaking from a definite Orthodox Christian perspective, and the denial of self in that realm is different. The denial of ourselves in that realm is to the point where we have a strong connection to God. We try to connect to God by replacing our will and filling it with God's love, God's grace, as God's love and grace not only consumes all, but replaces our sins, our transgressions, our breaking of the commandments, our ways to go about on how, as St. Nectarios always pointed out, God is watching. And with that, we have a very, very strong connection to Him. And why would we not have a strong connection to Him? Why would we not? We would deny our will to be replaced with God's will, as the saints somehow achieved. And the process of this is called, of course, in the Eastern Orthodox churches, theosis. We don't even know if our saints achieved theosis. However, we assume, because they were holy men and women, that this was either gained by becoming, spilling blood for His kingdom and becoming a martyr, or this was gained through that ascetic process, or that asceticism. And I always point out to people, one of our strongest benefactors and teachers of this ascetic life is St. Paisios. And he built his spiritual life on a foundation that many Athonite monks built. He came from, humble beginnings, just like many of them come from. They're either, in poverty. You get the very rare ones like St. Basil the Great, who came from a very affluent family and bred two more saints from his family and his siblings, which is amazing. But you usually have the humble beginnings and the making of a monk. And that's as far as, most of them go. Not many of them get the title or get the influence to become, what would be canonized as a saint. And now this is a very different process in the East than it is in the West. Obviously, our saint canonization is not humanistic at all. And the problem is that in the West, there's a very humanistic interpretation when it comes to the canonization of saints. That's a problem. That's a big problem that they have to correct. Once again, I'm not speaking on church politics, but the heterodox, no, they have to correct it. Otherwise, they'll continue down a path, well, that is not filled with God's grace. God's mercy be on them. But anyway, back to more of a humanist perspective. This humanism is going to consume us. This humanism is going to be a moral consumption product. It either comes in the form of how we get to where we need to go in a car. And I know a car is more of a tool, but it could be an expression of us. We could soup it up. We could dress it down. We could minimalize it. We could just buy it for the bare bones that it needs. God knows the price of gas right now is probably going to replace the cost of a car in a year if you're driving everywhere. But the issues here is that, you know, it could be an extension of us. Could be a guitar, right? You could soup it up. You could dress it down. You could bare bones it. It could be an acoustic. It could be an electric. It's an expression and or a way of who you are and how you channel that music that you play through you, right? You know, it's a little bit easier of an instrument to pick. Bass guitar too. I'm just thinking of instruments you can customize, or just easier to swap out parts and customize and change, you know, the parameters on it. It's kind of hard to do on like a keyboard or a piano or something like that. A little bit tougher to do. Drum kits, maybe. But anyway, you know, there's these expressions of human emotions, these expressions of human emotive gestures, and or interpersonal and interpersonal relationships. So, from individual to individual, God does not deny our individuality and our free will. That would be a ridiculous thing to deny, because the very fact that he created us is the very fact that why would he deny our free will? Why would he deny our very human nature? We know we're fallen into sin. Which leads me into the bigger topic. The topic of where and how humanism can become something destructive. It does become something that will consume the will of God in you. It will replace the will of God in you. And that's a problem. That's an issue. I've been speaking and or writing about it for a while now. And the West, with this conceptualization of me, myself, and I, id, ego, and the other one, I forgot already, has issues with this overlapping, with this how do I need to get ahead? How do I need to strive for my greater good? And sure, there should be a pursuit of happiness. Sure, there should be that gain, but that gain does either come at you either pay a price for it. And in America, unfortunately, our political class is so upheaved and out of touch with the working class and with the people here that they don't understand, and they continuously try to divide everything. And that is their humanistic perspective, their greed, their vices, their anger, their betrayal, their denial, their absolute catharsis for us has taken to a point where their humanistic intentions, as much as they want to virtue signal about it, especially on the left, somewhat on the right, that people see right through that veneer. People see right through that facade, and that facade is something that is just destructive. That is just something that is just so absolutely awful. And they can't handle the fact that people see through that people see through that veneer, that facade. And why? Why would people be able to see through that facade? Why would people have a problem with somebody placating about a social cause? I mean, pick your running. I mean, right now you got a buffet line of it, right? So now just pick one, and if a politician decides to come out and say, well, I'm with this, I'm with that, you know where they're going to stand. But a lot of them, just like politicians like to do, switch positions. And they're going to be they're going to be chameleons to that rendering of that cause for which lies where their pockets are getting lined, and that a lot of that individuation comes down to who's paying who. Where does the money go? Where is the money? Right? I mean, you could just look at all the corruption from the Clinton family. We could look at all the corruption from the Trump family. You could look at all the corruption from the Bush family, the Obama family. I mean, it's so obviously rampant. And this is why people, think that Trump was the catalyst to this. But in a very humanistic perspective, the hard truth is that he was a Jesuit, and a lot of those guys are in Jesuit circles, and that's obviously, me not being a fan of Western Christianity, is highly, highly problematic, as it should be. And that is where the continuation of this will come later. Now, those politicians launch a political campaign, right? And they do have a sense of, self, and they have a sense of, I need to do this, I need to make this better, I need to try to be as altruistic as possible to make it better for my fellow man. But we all know that comes with a price. We all know that comes with greed. We all know that comes with corruption. No human is incorruptible unless you're Batman. But in the real world and how real things operate and tend to give themselves to the need of, as fate would have it, you know, you have the altruistic person who is either, the ones who can't make it as actors become politicians. And the one who can't make it as doctors probably more than likely become politicians. Because I couldn't think of a more altruistic person than a nurse or a doctor. I mean, that to me shows the compassion. If you're really in it for the truth of helping other people, that God has graced you with those talents, then more power to you. And it's an absolute blessing. And that you don't even have to be Orthodox for me to say that. That's an absolute blessing. And God bless the good people that do that. I mean, that's just like firefighters. And I know on how our police officers are so looked at, but the good ones, there's a lot of good ones. And that's the problem. Those bad eggs want to spoil the whole bunch. And that's always unfortunate. But in this case, the very humanistic perspective of how politicians want to go about enacting change and how they want to go about being those failed actors that become, actors in a different sense, are either coming at it from I can help my fellow man out, but it needs to go as far as this, and then I need to either get paid for it, or I need to find a way on how I'm going to benefit from this. But who doesn't want to benefit, and who wouldn't go, nuts over oodles and oodles of cash that just somehow gets funded to you by people who are trying to make a living, be hardworking, and pay their taxes. And pay the taxes because if they don't, they'll be thrown in jail for it. I don't know what is more hypocritical. Like the fact that there's a Liberty Tax Service out there, or the fact that there's even a Liberty Tax to begin with. Or you're taxed to live in liberty, right? But that liberty perspective is also humanistic, right? It does have altruistic tendencies, but it does have tendencies to where this causes a paradigm shift. This causes a sense of, well, self, and I need to do this for myself. But in a lot of ways, in the real world, like that's a very young mentality to have. I need to grow up. I need to do things for myself to make things happen in the future for not only myself but others. You start like if you're raised in a good environment, and if you're obviously there's people who are raised in bad environments, but yet still have the character and just the pure power of will. Grace be to God, to get out of that and become something more, and become something that is just so their altruistic nature just takes over, and they just learn how to help people, and they don't go through the learned helplessness, or they don't try to deal with they try to deal with their demons on a very personal and extremely amazing level. Like that is just something that is just obviously another gift from God. But the humanistic part is where they want to take that liberty and change it into something else. They want to morph it into, well, if you don't do this for me, I can do this for you. But if you don't do this for me, I can do this for you. But if you don't do this for me, well, then we're going to throw you in jail. What? For what? Because you have oodles and oodles of cash to go commit war crimes, to go fund other governments that you might think is quote unquote not a democracy, or quote unquote it has a problem with this, has a problem with that, just because other people in a foreign land aren't seeing things your way. Well, guess what? Once you leave, they're not going to see things your way in the first place. So what was the point of even trying? Oh, I forgot. You got to make a profit because you're a leeching politician who covets and or veneers themselves as altruistic or doing things for the fellow good of their fellow man. And this is to the point where it becomes inherently self-destructive. It also is just absolutely so, well, I don't want to say it's not crucial, but that veneer and that facade has been lifted. And that is just to the fact that they pick these fringe dialectics, these fringe kind of altruistic, and you could say morality causes, attach themselves to it and say, well, I'm going to ride this out until I need to flip positions. Okay. That's humanistic. That is boiled down to just crushing, just absolutely crushing to the people who are in it for, well, we need to have this cause. We believe in this cause, but the person who was designated as the leader, well, now we're disheartened by it because they just betrayed us for a buck. I mean, why wouldn't they? In a way, that's just good business. But in another way, that is not being shepherded by the right kind of shepherd. You're following a false man, a false kind of person. I mean, look at what happened in Waco with Jim Jones. Prime example. That whole thing just got blown out of proportion, and obviously the government had stepped in, got involved, over-involved, and on top of it, his whole deal was just, obviously a problem. I mean, you could even go as far back, well, not that far back in American history, but look at the Manson murders. Technically, Charles Manson, and I'm not defending him, didn't commit murder. He did commit murder in the eyes of the law, but as far as his influence goes, He was that leader leading those other people to do it for him. So that's the issue. Like, how does that humanistic perspective turn into a perversion of altruism, right? How does that turn itself inside out? Well, everything that's of the devil is a perversion, and the devil can't create; he can only corrupt. So, with these politicians, that's what they do. That's where they take this, and that's where this humanistic perspective gets overturned. This is where this humanistic perspective gets so distraught, so absolutely destructive that it comes to a point where, I mean, it absolutely crushes the soul. And it gets to the point where people are disheartened by it, and they see that leader turn around and betray them. Turn around and say, well, we had this cause, and I was trying to take it because I felt so passionate about it. But I can tell you that I only felt passionate about it because I was making some money off of it. And then, I'll go to the next thing. I liked the taste of Pepsi for a while, but to tell you what, right now, Coca-Cola is just better. Because they're paying me more to sponsor them. So why wouldn't I sign that contract? What benefit is it to me for you people to follow me if I'm not making any money off of it, right? Politicians have this attitude that they're somehow edified and or actors that make policy, which is a ridiculous notion. But it's a ridiculous notion on their own terms because of how insanely megalomaniacal they've become and or just completely out of touch with reality. So their altruism is all but gone for a perverted reason. Gone for a reason well, if I need to become more humanistic and follow my fellow man, then, well, if he's going to follow me, I can think of myself like, oh, well, I'm doing him a favor. But it's a favor that I have already done. It's not a favor at all. I mean, it's it's the opposite of a favor. To the point where my whole politics doesn't understand religion rant is, quite to the point where I might even include that on a podcast, or I might even include that on something to where I'll make comments and I'll go back or wherever. Anyway, commenting on myself. How megalomaniacal is that? Anyway, there is a point to where politics just isn't going to cover it, to where politics just isn't going to make sense. I mean, it does on a systemic level. It can work with the quote-unquote two parties working together. But in reality, it turns itself into something that becomes like a hydra, becomes that dragon that St. George had to annihilate, that had to kill, because it's that dragon that comes and can become us. That monster can literally become who we are. And that's not good. That's not something that is to be achieved. That's not something that is to be looked after. Because that altruism will be perverted. That quote-unquote individual, I care about everybody as an individual perspective, will become perverted. It will become corrupted. And that's something that obviously politicians take to the point where they're not going to be able to deal with it. They're not going to be able to understand it. Because that is where that whole analogy of, well, I don't like the taste of Pepsi anymore, I'll switch to Coke. That's to where they're going to take that. Well, if I need to play this side, I'll play the other side. Elon Musk does it all the time. And for his own benefit, for his profit, for his name to just continually be out there to serve his ego. And I'm not saying he's an egotistical person, because he doesn't come off that way. Seems like he's just in another dimension with the way he thinks. And that is to the point where somebody so incredibly intelligent can look at a lot of this stuff, and you see them play both sides. You see them play how they can look at it as an intelligent person, say, well, I know how to play this like a fiddle, and they do it. They're very good at it, and comes to a point where it goes down to the person that's following a person, not I didn't pick a politician, Elon Musk, but let's say a politician like Trump, let's say a politician like Biden, and all of a sudden it falls through, it falls out. Your feet are not on solid ground anymore. You're wondering, well, I followed them into the fire, and now the fire is around me, and I'm not standing on solid ground anymore. So once you lose that foothold for following that person who is altruistic or maybe even humanistic in a lot of ways, it's going to knock the wind out of your sails. And that is not only something that happens in politics. I mean, that's just a fact of life. And that's just something that is going to happen, no matter what arena and or place you're in when it comes to those life lessons. So, continuing on. So then with this, you have this betrayal. You have this concept of where the politician is acting humanistically, right? Or altruistically. More so, they're trying to make these policy changes to enact some kind of morality, to legislate some kind of moral concept into play. But from that ether, from where that moral concept is derived, well, there's the Christian answer that it's derived from God. But to those who are secular and or in denial that God exists, which is foolish, they're gonna derive it from some kind of secular mindset, like just to justify that morality, which is probably 9 times out of 10 an inversion of what the actual morality is, and or the right justification for it is, because there is a dualistic nature to these concepts. But the issue here is, the issue bearing and grinning is this altruism. Now, could we say our doctor or nurse is way more useful than a politician? Yes. Could we say doctors and nurses, because of our political system, are now weighed down because of politicians? Yes. Could we also say that somebody who wants to be a doctor or a nurse, but then goes and sees people all around the world, or people who are in worse conditions than in the more developed countries, is taking a very altruistic approach, almost to the point where in a lot of ways it's a very saintly thing to do for them, for them to go and basically embrace the poor, the sick, the dying, to save them without, as long as they stay within their ethical means and parameters, and they're, good people, they will bear the fruits of their work, but it won't be in paychecks, right? It'll be in actual, genuine human experiences. Now, politicians are very rare when they do this, but this is why, like we see more so as an Orthodox Christian, like why would see somebody like the Pope and say, he's an elitist. He acts like he's another head of the politician. He has the audacity to claim that he is the vicar of Christ when he speaks ex cathedra and or holds this office. But the office doesn't make him an altruist. Doesn't make him a humanist. It doesn't make him above all else. I mean, he could very well, in musing this, the antithesis to what Christ wanted. Now they justify this with the rock of Peter, and the office of what the papacy should be. But the papacy is not just an office. There's also the person that holds that office. Now, as altruistic as Christians want to become, in many circumstances, this goes down to the followers, right? This goes down to the followers of the three denominations, right? And it goes down to the followers of whatever political party or moral flavor of the week, flavor of the month cause that people seem to latch themselves onto, which think it's going to justify their supposed morality. That's humanistic. That's that taking on a cause every week, month, or having a day to justify something and celebrate. I mean, some of these are good and noble. Some of these things are sure worthy of celebrating, like, our founding fathers, or like our people who have died in war on Memorial Day. They have one day to memorialize them, which I think is absurd. It's abhorrent. And you got a whole month dedicated to the talk about catharsis. Let's just leave it at that, to be completely appropriate. So now, when you have these things tied together, why are the weak, the dead, and the fallen, who have hopefully gone on to the grace of God, why do they get shoved off to the side? Are they not worth remembering? Are they not worth defending? Are they now, because they're dead, were they right-wing extremists or whatever the political class has now taken upon itself? Well, this embodiment of also the papal office, in a way, to us as Orthodox Christians, and I don't speak for all, I'm speaking from this perspective, is that papal office is a problem. It's problematic because, we see these politicians, they want to say, oh, it's the right, oh, it's the left, oh, it's this, oh, there's a veneer, oh, there's this, oh, but they're not doing this. There's a cause here, there's this, there's that, right? That's destructive. That's absolutely, ultimately destructive. Bears nothing but false fruits. And we see that a lot in common with Protestants when it comes to the papacy. Because the papacy to us is a lot of these false fruits and bearing this falseness. And it's in detriment to the followers of Catholicism. It's a detriment to those people who want to genuinely be Christian and what's in their hearts, right? So that's bad. That's not a good thing. But as I've always said, I would compare one of the most prominent ascetics, as I've mentioned earlier, St. Paisos, compare him to the past 200, 300 years of popes. His holiness is probably just immaculate and amazing compared to the popes. The office, or the clothes, or the uniform, whatever you want to call it, the Pope doesn't make the Pope. Now, I'm not saying there's not good cardinals, not good bishops, not good priests in Catholicism, because there certainly is, and people who obviously are Christian. Like there's an obviousness to that Christian genuine spirit, right? But Orthodox have to prove it through asceticism. They have to prove it through a monastic process, through a monastic life. They have to earn it rather than receive it by commission, right? And in fact, there's an omission to this, right? So they deny in a lot of ways, they deny their human existence. They deny the fact that they are something more. There's the will of God. And they literally want to replace the will of God with the will of their own, and that's what makes St. Paisos a saint and not just another monk on Athos. So, his human condition is what led him to realize there's an undefined, mysterious grace of God that he attained. Possibly. We don't, theosis is obviously another concept that is a mystery to us, especially us as Orthodox Christians. We don't know the totality of that. We certainly can't understand it. But the humanistic rational perspective will say, well, that's just a monk somewhere in a far off land. What does that have to do with the price of bananas, or what does that have to do with me, right? Well, doesn't that monk teach you something? Doesn't that ascetic practice teach you some humility? Doesn't it teach you how to attain grace? Doesn't it show you that there is a very real and human connection to things? Just as the doctor went to that undeveloped country to take it into consideration to help the sick, the dying, the poor. I mean, that is something that's so much more substantive than a corrupt politician of those countries supplying those countries guns and killing the youth. I mean, forget even about the pro-choice, pro-life argument. You handing those kids guns at young ages, and you're teaching them to hate others, and from right down to a violent religious practices and or tribal practices. I mean, you might as well forget any political argument or polemic that you could come up with, because guarantee you that it's worse off. It's worse off there, and that is a robbery of obvious youth that child can never have back, and God forbid they die at a young age. It's just you're taking the life right out of the child as they exist. Obviously comes in with an evil spirit, not a good one. But that doctor or nurse or person that's trying to help change the community, change the tide, is probably doing infinitely more good than the warlord. Well, they are doing infinitely more good than the warlord supplying drugs, guns, and money to the supposed side that they supposedly are aligned with. And to me, obviously, there's probably a religious connotation to it. There might even be a connotation to it where, this path goes to where this altruism is for the doctor, right? The nurse or the practitioner who is practicing in good faith and not just, handing out problematic shots to people either. Or, you have your politician on the other end trying to regulate, make rules, and see, you got this one bad egg, this one bad doctor or nurse, but we need to set up regulations for the good. I mean, a lot of this could be tied to other various political issues. But the humanistic approach is, once again, that bad is outweighing the good. For that one bad, there's a lot of good. And people have a problem, and they want to they take it as a hyper threat to the bad. I mean, which it is. It's definitely a threat when things are bad. But that humanistic nature, that individual nature, this can happen to me, it can happen to you. If you can do this, I can do this, right? So there is that mentality to it. But to me, it obviously shows that there's a lot more of those reasons tied to it. And like I went back with St. Paisos to where he literally replaced his will with the will of God, the will of something that is completely unfathomable to us. So that doctor or nurse acting altruistically is in a lot of ways unfathomable to us, because they went through a rigorous process to become what they are. To put that doctor in front of their name, or whatever derivative of letters after their name, if they're, both a doctor, a nurse, a medical practitioner, right? They went through a rigorous process. They disciplined themselves. They also probably sacrificed a lot in their young lives to achieve what they've become. So, in a lot of ways, their altruism breathed throughout and replaced, well, obviously they're humanistic and they're humanitarian, which would probably be a better way to define it, into something that is more than what they are. And that's something that is as related to Saint Paisos. That's a saintly thing to become. That's a saintly thing to achieve. But obviously, they're not doing it for asceticism. Now, as to why this altruism plays out on a humanistic perspective. Well, to be a humanist, obviously there's an individuation. Obviously, there's a force multiplier with that individuation. And it has caused the West to fall into this, well, in a lot of ways, analysis by paralysis, because when you call somebody an ism, or you label them with an ist or an ism, or some kind of ridiculous notion that it's basically bearing false witness or on unfounded claims, that how does that justify their existence? It's going to really turn things upside down. And maybe I'll take another, play out of Dr. Peterson's book. But obviously with catastrophic or very, very destructive tendencies, or just ultimately a tragedy that happens, or an upheaval in somebody's life. It could be good or bad. Who knows? But, this has an impact on people. This has an impact on their short term, their long term, their overall psychology. Maybe the word trauma is too overused, especially in this society, because people can slap that historism on that, or that traumatic tick event on that, and it can become their entire personality. It can become them. It can literally consume who they are. Is that humanistic? Well, you don't see things my way. So if you don't see things my way, then you must be this, this, and this. Okay. Well, but if I see things your way and I try to agree and I try to find some kind of altruistic compromise there, is that really forgoing my will to suit your needs? Or is it forgoing my human intention, which for all intents and purposes, it might very well be good or bad. It might very well be motivated by money. It might very well be motivated by something more, right? There might be a mutual exclusivity there. There might be a mutual or a hope for a mutual understanding, right? So there is a lot of these variables at play. There's a lot of these variables where those impacts are going to be very important to who we are, right? And that impactfulness to our human nature is important. It's going to cause us to obviously try to understand who we are, right? So it's going to justify those causes. It's going to try to justify those causes that become our morality, become our state-sponsored 2 minutes of hate, right? We don't know why. We don't know why we're doing it. We certainly don't understand. And at some point in time, these things phase out. They fizzle out because of, you could say, oh, remember the time when such and such, right? Or there's a lot of ways to say a lot of these kind of things. But in reality, there's also ways to go about changing it. Altruism is pretty close to changing it, but the humanistic aspect of that is that, those people who truly do serve others, which in a lot of ways, if you're not somebody who completely lives under a rock, you do serve others. Like if you're somebody's working at a McDonald's, you literally serve other people. Um, you know, or if you're somebody who, like I said previously, is a doctor or a nurse, you're obviously serving others. You're obviously trying to help people. And that's, a good thing. The McDonald's employee, who knows? But to take like a corporate complaint and or a moral issue to somebody who is a person working at a McDonald's, they're obviously going to say, I'm just here to do my job, right? So, in a lot of ways, that's both humanistic, but you don't know the altruism that could be behind that. Maybe they have a sick parent that's sick and dying in a nursing home. Maybe they have a family of four to feed. In a lot of ways, there's motivations behind what they're doing. Maybe they're doing this to go to college, trade school, whatever. They're trying to fund and go about things the right way and make an honest person into a productive member of society, right? And they're already pretty much participating in being a productive member of society. So that to me right there shows character. It shows that they're obviously, for their intents and purposes, that they want to be something more, or they could just be a McDonald's employee for the rest of their life. At least they're trying to do something. Give them more credit where credit is due. And to me, that's honesty. That's more honest than the thief. It's more honest than the liar. That's certainly more honest than the person trying to, tout some kind of weird ideology to you and them not just you bearing and grinning it and then whatever it might be. The humanist perspective that's supposedly justified, right? But comes a point in time where a lot of that stuff does get a bit ridiculous. A lot of that stuff just doesn't make sense to us because it's very humanistic. It's something that could be very catastrophic. It could be to the point where that catastrophe or that trauma that happens in that person's life is where it's offset. It's going to be offset because that traumatic or terrible event could consume that person. Just like somebody who is so in the Word of God will come to you and say, you know Christ, right? In a lot of ways, to us, to me as an Orthodox Christian, do you know Christ has almost a completely different connotation than Western Christians, right? And they could very well have a similar way to interpret it, but it to me it's completely change and it's transformative, and it's obviously something that is a very different connotation. But anyway, that's a different rant. That's not humanistic, right? Because now you're seeking something that's transcendental. Now you're seeking something that's outside of yourself. Because, if you're going to embrace Christ as a man or the Theotokos as a woman and see the virtues that come out, the transcendental facts that come out, I mean, this could boil right down to a comic book character with, we got you want to replace a favorite comic book character that was written by straight white males. What would they know? But now you're interjecting a very subjective, humanistic objectivity to this, and now you're just denying the fact that somebody created something. But you can't recognize, that character, such as Tony Stark, he's a rich, straight white male, very rich, in fiction land. He dealt with alcoholism. Nobody can like look beyond what he is and say, he's struggling with an addiction. He's got this mad genius kind of persona going on, and you can't look beyond that. Your altruism can't take you to that point to where, he needs to be a black, gay, whatever, what have you, millionaire or bum who by that point, who the heck cares? And have an issue with heroin. versus alcoholism. Oh, now I can identify with him because he's speaking to me. Well, that transcendental addiction from whatever traumatic, mainly probably because of his father on Howard Stark, treated him as a fictional comic book character. He has to have dealt with that his whole life because he literally could never, on his hero's journey, defeat or deal with the death of his father. He deal with the literal death of his father and the other part, the soulful and death, which in turn becomes who he was. So, that drink literally consumed him. That drink literally threw his life through an absolute hell. And that's just it. What does that say? Like you're forgoing somebody who doesn't look like you, doesn't act, doesn't think like you, but you can't relay some kind of humanity, mainly altruistic, to his tendency to deal with his problems, to cover it up with his substance. To me, that's just like, that doesn't show there's transcendental values to us all. And the problem is that some people are really good at hiding it. Some people are really bad at hiding it. Some people are obviously lead in with things that are, more so obligatory, or covering something up, right? So that is humanistic. That's individualistic. That's not showing an altruistic, transcendental kind of mentality to it. And as I've said this with the politicians to the saints, to the doctors and nurses, they all have forms of altruistic natures, but they all have forms of humanistic natures. We could say the ascetic, the saint, transforms that, literally transcends it, right? Because why would they be honored as a saint? Why would St. Basil, the doctor of the church, be honored as a saint if he was just a doctor? Why would he be honored as a saint? I don't know. That's got a very different mentality to it. Now, to wrap this up, because this is probably going to go into maybe a bigger concept and possibly, some future podcasts and or different subjects, that there is a definite connection between altruism and humanism, as I pointed out. But there's also a connection to the virtues, and altruistically, there's a connection to viciousness and the vices and acting humanistically. So these connections are prominent. These connections are so influential. The influence is there. And, if I didn't have an influence from God, from the divine, then why would I even be a Christian, right? I could have chose something else. But the true path and somebody like St. Paisos speaks to me. And he speaks, obviously, to me through God. And why would I even bother saying, St. Paisos, pray for us, right? Why would we take that concept of him, of who he was as a human being, and turn it into something that is more than who we are? We know the soul and the will of God is something more than what we are. We know that God is something more than what we are. We also know that we're a part of God, which is why we are in communion with God. Is that altruistic? Is that humanistic, or is that something that's beyond us? Is that something that's transcendental? Like, I know I picked Tony Stark, a fictional character, maybe a bad example, but that alcoholism and the death of his father, the literal death of his father, took him to the limit, right? The figurative death of his father also took him to the limit because of the trauma that was inflicted. Now, is it the same trauma that could be inflicted on somebody whose childhood was stolen in an undeveloped country, either due to death, violence, or other extenuating circumstances? I don't know. Is that the same thing? Is that like a grown man dealing with that traumatic problem versus a child who doesn't even have the capacity nor the mindset, and that life is taken too soon? And is that a justification or ramification for God to deal with? Well, children are innocent in the eyes of God. So by His grace, which outweighs everything, is that outweighing our very altruistic nature, or is our altruistic nature just God's grace working through us as human beings? Now, that humanistic, vindictive viciousness is something that could attack us. It's something that will attack us. From the viciousness and the vices are from the very which thing of how we deal with sin and how we repent from sin. Now, this altruistic process is going to obviously have a very compounding impact on us. And it's to the point to where it's going to destroy. And it's going to destroy the very fabric of our reality, of who we are. And with that altruism, you pray and hope for those kind of people. You hope for those people to help you out. I mean, God forbid you get into an emergency, you want the doctor and nurse to be competent, right? And you want people making snap decisions to help you, right? You want that police officer to protect. You want that firefighter to go into that burning building and be a brave soul and put out those fires. Try to rescue the people that are in there. God forbid anything happens to them, right? And that's just it, where it's like this altruistic mentality does get lost through the humanistic perspective. And both kind of go hand in hand, because you have to have that dualistic nature with the good and the evil, the good and the bad. But it also crushes the fact that people are going to have a hard time dealing with this. And it's the constant fall of our condition, or it's the constant condition of the fall for our free will. So this is going to, obviously be a huge issue. And maybe it continued going forward because humanity continues, humanity exists, but the humanistic aspect to it all is that we have a very important role to play in this. And God's grace, obviously, is going to help. Having that grace, having that will, that mentality to strive for that grace of God is very important, especially to people who are Christian. Maybe more so religiously minded, but I don't know. I don't really subscribe to that. I don't really agree with it for obvious reasons. But yeah, there is those mentalities at play, and there are those mentalities that are going to be very circumstantial to our existence.